As you may know, psychology defines itself as a scientific discipline. In other words, psychology uses systematic research methods to increase knowledge and understanding. Given that, the reading for this class makes frequent reference to different types of studies, so I want to make sure you're familiar with what that entails. You won't need to be able to go through all of the steps to design a study or even critique a study, but it'll be helpful to understand variables and research design enough to be able to provide a simple summary of how we could answer a research question about leadership. This will also help you understand the bigger picture of what we know about leadership and how we know it, to better understand why the authors of the New Psychology of Leadership say the satisfactory psychology of leadership must be informed by the use of multiple research methods, on page 138. In research, we're interested in variables. Anything can have different qualities or quantities. In leadership research, the variables might be follower attitudes, behaviors of a leader, group outcomes, or a wide variety of other related things. When we're conducting research, we have to think about what we call the operational definition. Basically, that's a fancy way of saying we need to explain exactly what we mean. We can do that in two ways, by saying how we're going to measure the variable or by saying how we're going to manipulate the variable. Measurement includes two broader types, observation and self-report. Manipulation is usually done so we can compare two levels of a variable or two groups. For example, writing scenarios so that a leader seems to be very high in task behavior or very low in task behavior, so we can compare perceptions of the two types of leaders. In other cases, though, we manipulate a variable so all research participants have the exact same context. For example, if we want to find out how a follower's personality influences behavior with a high task leader, we'd measure both personality and productivity, but create a situation where the participant is working with a high task leader. I mentioned observation is one way to measure a variable, and that idea is probably familiar. I think at some point, most of us have caught ourselves watching the way a person was doing something or the way a group was interacting. The process of using observations to operationalize a variable is much more formal than those processes, though. To have a reliable and valid measure, observations need to be based on systematic definitions and need to use systematic methods to record data that's based on those definitions. Observations are more complicated than people watching, in part because of that process of recording data. Unless we're using a video recording, we'll have to record observation data at the time rather than after the fact. Self-report measures are also commonly used in leadership research, and they're probably not new to you. A couple of things to keep in mind, though, is that there are a wide range of formats for self-report measures. They can be interviews or they can be paper-based. They can ask participants to respond to a closed-ended scale, or they can ask open-ended questions. They can directly ask the participant something, or they can give a statement, ask for a reaction. The common element, though, is that the participant is reporting on their own thoughts, feelings, reactions, and so forth. Measurement provides information about our variables, but we need to consider a number of questions in determining what that information means. One of the questions is whether the measurement is consistent, otherwise known as reliable. If it's not consistent, we can't really draw any knowledge from the results because we don't know how much variation is there because of what we're interested in and how much it's because of the measure. If a measure is reliable, then we need to ask what we're measuring. We need to question the validity of the measure. Types of validity can be a little overwhelming, but I have a feeling the idea is familiar. If you've heard someone say, I knew the material, I just had a hard time with multiple choice tests, you've heard someone questioning the validity of a measure. These ideas are important when we're thinking about a topic as popular as leadership. As I mentioned in the overview in the perspectives module, some of the theories have related measures, but each theory presents a different perspective, so the conclusions we can draw are different. In other words, we may have a very reliable measure of leadership that still isn't measuring what we want to measure. In some cases, too, consultants or authors will write a survey to help people think about their leadership styles, and they might not go through the process of confirming reliability and validity. Those surveys might be helpful for personal reflection, but we'd want to be careful about how we use the information. We frequently talk about reliability and validity in the context of measurement, but the ideas apply to manipulation as well. When we ask about reliability, we will ask about whether the manipulation was designed in a way that would allow for consistency across participants. When we ask about validity, we'll ask if the researchers are creating conditions or contexts that represent their variables. The research design is the overall plan for the study, or how we're looking at the variables. There are three broad categories: experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental. Note that the experiment is the only design with a manipulated variable. Experimental designs are often considered to be the best approach because they allow a researcher to draw conclusions about cause and effect. But the process that allows for that can also make it less realistic. In other words, the finding might not apply in other settings. Sometimes it's also not ethical or practical to manipulate a variable. For example, we might question whether it be ethical to put someone in an out group in a group situation to see how they react to the leader. Quasi-experimental design can sometimes seem a lot like an experiment, but without the manipulated variable. They're more natural because they're conducted with naturally occurring groups, which is part of the reason the variable isn't manipulated. We might use this approach to understand the experience of individuals who feel like they're in the out group because they feel like they're in the out group. This approach doesn't allow us to control for other influences, though, so it limits our ability to say things about what causes or affects their thoughts or behavior. So, for example, just because they think they're in the out group, we don't know how the leader actually feels about them or how their leader behaves towards them. Similarly, non-experimental designs do not allow us to make statements about cause and effect. They allow us to describe relationships, though, and do so when a variable can't be manipulated. I hope this overview has helped you to start thinking a little bit more about why the authors of the new Psychology of Leadership say the satisfactory psychology of leadership must be informed by the use of multiple research methods, and what those methods are. The activity ingredients for this module will help you fill in the details to add to that understanding.